Afternoon, everybody. How are we? Good to see all of you. It's an honor to be here with all of you. A lot of familiar faces in the room, a lot of new faces. And President Trump is back, and the golden age of America has most definitely
begun. That was Karoline Leavitt at her first press conference for Donald Trump on January 27th, 2025. I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil J. Young.
And we're here to talk about press secretaries. And we're going to focus in on Karoline Leavitt's role in the White House. And it's going to give us an opportunity to talk a little bit about the evolving role of the press secretary in the White House, but also how Karoline Leavitt in particular has begun to carve out a space to channel Donald Trump into the media space. But let's begin with today's biggest news, which is we have a pope, Neil.
We do. And an American pope. I mean, this is enormous news. I think it sounds like most people were pretty surprised by this. Obviously, the conclave wrapped up really quickly, so this also means it wasn't a very difficult decision for the bishops to come to. But I don't think anyone was really expecting this.
No, Neil, I don't think anybody was expecting it. I did not even hear his name mentioned.
The most important thing is he's now known as Pope Leo XIV.
Exactly. And apparently there is some interest in his choice of the name Leo because the last Leo, the 13th, was Pope in the 1890s and was very much involved in the struggle between workers and capitalism at that time.
Yes, and he's really credited with, well, first of all, he has the second longest papacy. And so he went into the 20th century and is sort of considered the first pope of the 20th century, and also is credited with developing the theology of Catholic social teaching, which is an enormous, shaper of 20th century Catholicism, to say, nothing of its influence on the world at large. And I think that's an incredibly important nod here that suggests a lot of significance. Pope Leo is from Chicago, an American, but he spent almost his entire career in Peru, and clearly has that sort of Catholic social teaching theology that I think we see more clearly in his public pronouncements around immigration issues and the marginalized communities. And so he's definitely not a direct copy of Francis, but I think there's a huge overlap there. And I think probably most importantly for a lot of us, especially those of us who aren't Catholic, he's not a conservative. I think sort of parsing where he lands on the theological political landscape will take a while to do, but clearly not a conservative, and certainly a repudiation of MAGA, of Trumpism, of even, I think, the American bishops. We could say a lot more, but that's probably all we could say.
Well, and apparently somebody dug up right away a rebuke that Provost had made of J.D. Vance, and that's kind of interesting. Let's also just toss in about Leo XIII that one of the great American figures that he inspired was Dorothy Day.
Yes.
Who then created the Catholic Worker, which was a quasi-socialist organization, even though Leo XIII spoke strongly against socialism, and he believed that socialism was actually a bad outcome of the conflict between worker and capital. Nevertheless, Dorothy Day did kind of flirt with a socialist theological approach. And it looks like Leo XIV, well, somebody else said on Twitter, at last there will be good pizza in the Vatican. But as a New Yorker, of course, I repudiate that. But he also just seems like a nice guy.
He does. I don't know if you saw the TV, or you were watching TV when he came out, but I just happened to have it on, and so watched NBC News's coverage of it. And when he came out and the crowd was cheering, he got very emotional, and I just found myself really touched by that. Like again, I'm not Catholic, but it felt like good news in a time in which that feels few and far between. And seeing his eyes grow teary it just felt like there was a human there, and someone
Right.
with a heart and with compassion, and that's important right now. So
Right.
I think we should take this as some sort of a win.
Yeah, yeah, no, very, very pleased, and very pleased to see the Cardinals being this thoughtful
Yeah.
about this moment in history and the role the church should play in it. One last thought about Leo the 14th is what I've also seen people talking about is that appointing an American pope is a way of reaching back to Americans who are less and less involved with the Catholic Church. And the number of Catholics in the United States is shrinking, even though it's growing in places like Africa. And there is apparently kind of a sharp divide between younger Catholics who are much more conservative and older Catholics who are much more, um, liberal and see Catholicism as a gospel of love, not a discipline.
Yeah, I mean, there's gonna be a lot of ink spilled over this, and I'm really looking forward to reading the commentary. I think that's a really interesting aspect of this. I mean, it just sort of having an American pope will put American Catholicism into a particularly interesting lens of analysis
Yep.
as we go forward. And I think, especially at this time when the American Catholic Church the U.S. Catholic Church is riven by so many different divisions.
Mhm.
Um, I just think that as a historian of religion, this becomes all the more fascinating for me.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to be following the new Pope and what kind of moves he makes, what he says in the first weeks of his papacy. But I think one of the nice thing about being Pope is there's no such thing as the first 100 days. I mean, you've
Right.
got like thousands of years of popes.
Yeah.
And so the first 100 days, it'll just calm things down a little bit. Okay. So in other stories, late last week, Donald Trump signed an executive order demanding an end to public funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. The CPB responded with a lawsuit. Yay, public broadcasting. Now, apparently, rural communities in red states would see the greatest harm from these kinds of cuts. And it has something to do with how the funding is structured, which we could talk about a little bit. But it's also important to know that since the CPB was funded, every Republican president but Gerald Ford has tried to do away with it. Um, so, Neil, what do you think is going to happen going forward? And why are rural communities going to be hurt worst by these cuts if they go
Well,
through?
you can tell me more about how this funding structure really impacts rural communities, but I just think sort of the way in which CPB and the PBS and NPR, I think, which are the most well known of its operations, feature in the American imagination, and particularly in the conservative imagination, is of sort of East Coast elitism,
Right.
right? Of sort of wonky, heady, um, cigar swilling types. And to know that actually it may impact rural communities the most, I think speaks to just the breadth of what these things do, and the breadth of their services. The question is what's going to happen going forward. I don't know. Is this something that Democrats restore from day one once they have the power to do so? Maybe. Is this really going to go through? Is Congress going to approve this? Probably in this configuration.
Well, it depends, and the budget structure is very wonky. So the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is budgeted 2 years ahead,
Right.
and they do that to insulate it from this kind of partisan struggle. And so, what's at stake is $2 billion over the next 2 years, about half of which goes to NPR and half of which goes to PBS. And I'll talk about how that money's spent in a second. But theoretically, the money has been appropriated through 2027. So if the decisions from the bench that are coming down hold consistently, judges will say, well, this money has already been appropriated, so therefore we're going to spend it. What's interesting is that the spending is structured in such a way as to tie particularly Congress people to the funding because the money does not go directly to PBS or NPR. Instead, it goes to the stations themselves.
The affiliates.
Yeah, the affiliates. And so the affiliates then use the money to buy programming from PBS and NPR. And what's important about that is two things.
Yeah.
One is that these stations also play a local role. I mean, for example, here in Western Massachusetts, we have a show called The Fabulous 413, which is news exclusively about Western Massachusetts. It's extremely well done.
Mm-hmm.
If our local public radio station were to disappear, that program would disappear, even though it would still be possible to get fresh air as a podcast or something like that. But the other role these stations play is a public safety role. So, for example, in places like the Midwest, where you will get a tornado warning is on your NPR station and on your public radio or public television station. So they play a very important role in terms of local education. One of the first distance learning shows was called Sunrise Semester, and that was always on a public radio station or public television station. So Congress people will be pushing back about this. And then, of course, there is the narrative about children's programming, which there's much more out there than Sesame Street for children. And it plays a really important role in early childhood education in places that don't have early childhood education or rural places where getting your kid to a daycare or an early childhood school is difficult to impossible. So this funding is really very deeply embedded in ordinary Americans' lives.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, I just think the point about congressional districts and their attachment to and the way in which the funding has been structured, in some ways, I think was probably about the preservation of the corporation because when this was created in 1967, there was no permanent funding structure, right? It was always vulnerable to these sort of 2-year budget cycles, and yet, as you point out, pretty much every congressperson has some sort of connection to it, and all the more so if they're in rural districts, because there's a less of a diversity of funding coming there, or less diverse sort of industries in their region, and so this represents important dollars that come into the community that their name is attached to. And even as those are places where we think again aren't the sort of PBS watching crowd, all the services and all the information that's distributed through this means, I think complicates the whole political scenario for this going forward. So we'll see. But I mean, like this, we've said this over and over again with sort of every executive order that leads to some drastic cut. Surely, X, Y, and Z districts are going to respond to this differently. And we're not seeing that from Congress. So why should we expect this to be the one that really makes a difference? I don't know. But Trump has certainly figured out a way to get something done that no other Republican president has been able to do so. It's also because he doesn't care about precedent or constitution or like divisions of power or all the rest. But it'll be interesting to see how this one plays out politically for sure.
It most certainly will. And I just want to give a shout out before we leave this topic to Doug Bennett, who was the president of NPR. And he foresaw the possibility of something like this several decades ago before he became president of Wesleyan University, which is how I knew him. Doug was president of NPR, and he devoted himself to raising money so that NPR would not have to depend on tax dollars. So NPR, for example, only gets about 5% of its funding from tax dollars, which is easily replaceable, right? And not inconsequentially, Doug is the father of Michael Bennett, who is the senator from Colorado, and James Bennett, who worked for the New York Times for many years. So it's a family that's really devoted to public service. And that was really very prescient of him to do that.
And I think we should just say one more thing about that, which is that, as many people have pointed out in the last couple of days, the funding for CPB works out to about $1.50 per American citizen. Right? I mean, you hear $2 billion. I think most people know that doesn't represent that much of an enormous federal budget. But really, when you dial it down to $1.50 per person.
Right.
This isn't about government efficiency. This isn't about reducing the size or the role of the role. I mean, like, it is about the role of government. It's certainly not the size of government,
Right.
but this is about axing a key institution
Yep.
that is devoted to accuracy and truth, and
Yep.
and that's at the heart of this.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And, you know, I think about the fact that the Navy has now, in the last 2 weeks, lost 2 planes collectively worth about $120 million.
Right.
They just let them roll into the sea. Well, you know, that's waste, fraud, and abuse, if you ask me.
And Trump's birthday celebration, which I'm sure we'll talk about. I mean,
Right.
we have to do an episode on that. The tally I'm hearing already is $100 million for that.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I'm sure it's going to go way above that by the time we're over.
Of course, because they're also going to have to repave the roads of Washington, D.C., because you can't actually drive tanks down the road and have them survive in the shape they were in. Okay, so let's talk about the supply chain dysfunction because of Trump's tariffs, which has also been in the news this week because some Senate Republicans want the president just to shut up about how many toys children are going to get at Christmas and whether it's 3 or 30 or whatever, referring to 11-year-old as beautiful baby girls, which I thought was weird since 11-year-olds aren't babies. Trump argued that the 37 dolls such a baby girl might receive at Christmas could be pared down to 5 dolls. And then he promoted the idea of Barbie factories returning to the United States. Fun fact, Barbies were never made in the United States. Barbie first hit the stage in 1959, and she was made in Japan before shifting her birthplace to China. Just as a footnote, China makes 70% of the dolls in the world. So, Neil, I'm sorry, I'm only giving you 3 dolls for Christmas.
Dang it. Okay, this is wild, and I feel like it's one of the most rich texts for us to unpack because there's so much at work here. You know, Trump's creepy obsession with young women, his like devotion to this very bizarre number, right, of 37 to 5, right? Like, this is stuck in his head and he's not going to let go of it.
Right.
Also, Republican fretting over this, right? They're worried about the messaging around it, not the disastrous economic policy that these tariff proposals represent. Just don't talk about dolls. But I thought one of the really smart things I saw on Twitter this week, which I will continue to call it that, was to say that, you know, Trump and Elon and all the other men who keep using dolls as the example, it's really an important sort of window into a deeper psychology here, and also like a deeper psychology attached to the messaging, which is that American consumerism is actually a feminine activity, a feminine pastime, something that, you know, silly women do. That, you know, and if we can make consumerism about that, not what it's been sort of historically in the American imagination, let alone to say what it's been in sort of a conservative free market estimation of, you know, individual freedom, prosperity, all those things, but about some sort of shrill, silly thing that women do, then we can wreak economic disaster on this country, and we can make the sort of accommodation of that new economic reality a masculine virtue. And I think that that is really smart. And we're already seeing that at work in Fox News and other places, where it's like being held up that it's a patriotic duty to not buy anything anymore, to sort of suffer through this period economically. But I think that this doll language really sort of drives home the gendered dimensions of how this is going to be spun going forward.
I think that's really smart, Neil. And then it also covers up 2 other really important things. One is that, in fact, the big economic hit is going to be around things like potash, which, you know, we get from Canada almost exclusively, and farmers need it to fertilize their fields. And all of a sudden, the price of that has gone sky high. The other thing it really points to, and I've been listening to a lot of podcasts where everybody's referencing their college friend who owns a small business that does this thing or that thing. But there are two problems that small businesses are having right now. One is they are doing their ordering for Christmas now. And it's sort of hard for those of us who work semester by semester
Yeah.
to wrap our heads around. But you need to get your orders in for Christmas now. And if you don't know how much those orders are going to cost, you don't know what to order or how much of it. The other thing is that because the tariffs have actually wrapped in a range of things that have already been ordered, there are a range of small business people who are suddenly paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in tariffs for things they've already ordered, that are already on the boat, that are landing in San Francisco, that they didn't budget for.
Right.
And it's not just that this cost is going to be passed on to consumers. It's that if consumers take a look at it and say, that's too much, I'm not paying for it, they're stuck with a lot of really expensive stock that they can't sell. So what we're really kind of looking at is the possibility of a cascade of business failures down the line.
Absolutely. And I think that, John Dickerson was talking about this on the Slate Political Gabfest this last week. And he had been interviewing all these toy shop owners across the country. And one of them said that he does 90% of his ordering in the month of May for December, because that's what you need to do in order for it to all be on the shelves in time and all that. And that he was going to order none of the products that he would in a given year. So 90% of the stuff that he was going to order right now, he's not doing, because he knows exactly what you've just said, which is that he isn't going to pay the tariff today because he knows 7 months from now, no American family is going to pay, twice what they used to pay for those same Christmas items a year ago. And that several of the toy shop owners he was interviewing were saying it wasn't a question of if they were going out of business, but if it was a matter of weeks or a matter of months. And so we're going to see, toy shops going out of business, but like ripple effects in every direction, not being driven through the toy industry, but just this is one sort of, vantage point by which we can see the larger ramifications of all of this.
Yeah. And, I think the holiday giving season, shall we say, not the Christmas season, has a particular resonance for Americans because, of course, every year there's a toy that's really hot that people can't get. I mean, I remember the year that it was Barbie's minivan. And my 5-year-old nephew, Diego, who I'm now going to embarrass by telling the story on him, had to have Barbie's minivan. That was like the only thing that would make Christmas okay. And his parents were like, look, just give it up. There aren't any Barbie's minivans. And I got on the phone and I finally found one in West Hartford. And I drove to West Hartford and got the last Barbie's minivan in all of New England, I think. And it did, in fact, make his Christmas. Now, where I think they're right about consumerism is, of course, all of these things are kind of ephemeral. Barbie's minivan then disappeared sometime in the next 18 months and was never heard from again. But I think Americans have a particular sentimentality about children and the holiday season that they like to feed. And if Americans can't feed that, I think it's going to be a big deal.
For sure. I mean, this feels deeply as deeply American as apple pie, right? I do anticipate some interesting messaging around this. I bet Fox News and others are going to say, you know what, all of this is good because by getting rid of all the junk, all the gift buying, we're getting back to the true meaning of the season, right? Like that there's going to be a religification to this, a sacralizing of what this all is. But that's many months away. And I think in the interim is going to be the economic reality of empty shelves. That's going to be the visual. Far before we get to Christmas buying lists is the empty shelves at CVS, at the grocery store, at Home Goods, at all the stores that people are used to walking into and seeing, American abundance at display. It's going to be visible in front of them in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Neil. We'll have to do a show down the line on Trump as Grinch. Um, so, our last news item is a bipartisan bill called the Genius Act, Senate legislation to regulate cryptocurrency. And this is a really big deal. The bill is backed by the crypto industry, but it has a lot of enemies on both sides of the aisle. And both parties are wrangling with each other about it. Most recently, Democrats have pointed to the Trump family's crypto ventures as one major example of the currency's potential for corruption and conflict of interest. Neil, do you own any crypto?
I don't understand it, and I don't want to understand it. I mean, I really just want it to go away, like off my lawn, out of my,
Yeah.
out of my cash-based bank account. Obviously, this is what's happening with the Trump family, and I just feel like I've said this over and over again, but it's worth saying again. Jimmy Carter sold his peanut farm
Right.
before he became president because the idea it might be some conflict of interest. They have gotten rid of none of their existing business ventures, and in fact are using the White House and the presidency to expand and exploit those opportunities here. I think in terms of the politics of this, I mean, it seems to me the Republicans are pretty aligned with anything that has to do with like pushing crypto forward. I think the interesting thing that's happening here politically is the debate within Democrats, because yeah, they're aligned with saying that clearly this is a corrupt family operation that's going on with anything that's affiliated with Trump. But when it comes to like cryptocurrency, the crypto industry in general, you have these two camps within the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
One's the regulation camp, which is led by folks like Christian Gillibrand. But then the other camp is like to keep it outlawed. They don't want it to happen at all. And so I think that's going to be an interesting debate within the Democratic Party. I think Republicans who need a couple of Democratic votes to like move stuff ahead, like this act you just mentioned, there's certainly some Republicans who look like if their amendments can come together, you know, could align with Republicans in sort of pushing crypto legislation forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough I mean, crypto exists. It's just there. Like
Right.
you, I don't own any of it. Kara Swisher once famously said that she did own crypto, but she had forgotten where it was. So, and that's the kind of thing, it's
Like
like,
I need another login.
that's right, another login, my crypto wallet. But one of the great concerns, and I would bet that this is happening, is that you can just show up at the White House and say, yes, I've made, I bought this many Trump coins or whatever. And even now, there's two kinds of crypto, I think. One of which is called a stable coin. And that's what, for example, the Trump coin is, the Melania coin is. And so the coin itself might not actually be worth that much. But if you buy it in a sufficient amount, the transfer fees are significant. So even though the Trump coin isn't actually worth that much, every time people buy and sell it, Trump makes money. And apparently the family has made hundreds of millions of dollars in these transfer fees. But it's also an almost untraceable form of bribery.
Right.
And, I think about Jess Smith walking into the Harding White House with suitcases full of money from the oil companies to gain access to the Teapot Dome reserves. And that, of course, was eventually uncovered. Harding died in the middle of the investigation. But what we're looking at is so much bigger, and the corruption is almost exhausting in its size and scope.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's turn to a more cheerful topic. Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary. What's her story, Neil? How did she get to this job as the youngest person to ever inhabit this job?
Youngest person ever, 27 years old, her entire career life. We're talking about 5 years here.
Right.
But all 5 years have been only in service to Trump, but really Trump world. I mean, she did work for a time, I guess, during the Biden presidency, when Trump was out of office, she worked for Elise Stefanik. I'm
Elise
blanking on
Stefanik.
Elise
Yes.
Stefanik.
Poor Elise Stefanik, who was going to be UN ambassador and gave up her position in leadership and is now just a little dowdy congresswoman like everybody else.
Right, but Leavitt is clearly has spent her entire career in MAGA world,
Right.
And even running for Congress, didn't win that race in her home state of New Hampshire. But I don't know, what is there to say about her? She's good at her job, I think. I mean, if her job is spinning and serving to communicate Trump's message in a way that I think is like a complete mirror of what he would say, or a complete copy of what he would say. She has his voice. She has his. She is a perfect sort of vessel to carry forward his ideas into the press briefing room. And I also think she's gotten even better at this job over the time that she's done it. I mean, if you watch the clips, as I, for some reason, am wont to do on Twitter of her, because it's just some part of my self-flagellation every day to like watch her do her thing. She has even become more adept at the sort of MAGA communication style, and I think that that's key to this too. Is she looks like she's a Fox News hostess, and of course that's what Trump thinks is a sign of competency, a sign of intelligence, and I think so in that way she fits just within his idea of like the type of person who should be in this role.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find very interesting about her is she has a genuine, shall we say, working class background.
Yeah.
Her father sold used cars. The family owned an ice cream shop in New Hampshire. She's the first person in her family not just to go to college, but to graduate from college.
Yep.
And she seems to have known from a very young age what she wanted out of this. She gets to St. Anselm's College in New Hampshire, and she has a lot to say about, being the lone conservative at this school, which St. Anselm doesn't strike me as very radical. Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
I'm sure that, as the Catholic Church spans the spectrum, I'm sure there was like a diverse student body there, but like, come on.
Right. Exactly.
I'm sure there was a pro-life club. I'm sure there was a Catholic Republican organization.
Right.
But, this obviously is part of the identity that MAGA people need, right? It's like they were the lone voice and like out there in the horrible, liberal wilderness.
Right. And so, she goes on a softball scholarship. So she was an athlete, but then sees really early on, like her sophomore year, that there is more to life than playing softball. She starts writing little articles for the school newspaper, which she finds to be, a hotbed of radicalism. So she starts her own television show. And of course, St. Anselm's is one of those places. Hofstra is another. The reason they hold presidential debates there is not just where they are, but because they can actually they have a full television studio to handle that. So she knows she wants to go into media. She starts getting internships. She gets an internship at the White House where she's basically answering the letters people write to Donald Trump. She then goes to work for Elise Stefanik. She's actually in the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, which apparently there are a couple of lost tweets of her praising Mike Pence for keeping it together. But after that, she comes out as an election denier. And then she runs for Congress in New Hampshire and does pretty well, right?
Yeah, and she makes the sort of election denialism front and center of that campaign in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And she was running against, I think, a well-known Republican local figure in the primary there. She was insanely behind him in early polling. But, the things we read about her, I think there was two things that really stuck out was that she has a enormous work ethic. I mean, that she was pounding the pavement, calling all the voters, knocking on the doors, like every hour of the day. And also, obviously, the connection to Trump. Like, she went to him, and at first the request of him was just don't endorse the other guy, right? She knew that would have made her dead in the water. And he said that he would hold back on saying anything. She, sort of ground out her win in the primary but lost pretty handily, I think, in the general election. But I think, there's an interesting point in that short biography of hers where she is sort of developing herself as a TV reporter,
Right.
but decides and she has an internship with the Manchester, I think it was the NBC station,
Yep.
a really plum position that would have been, what anyone wanting to go into TV broadcasting would have used as the entry point into that career. And at the time they ask her to stay on, she gets the opportunity, the White House internship, and she takes that. And I think that's sort of this interesting moment where, it's sort of a sliding doors moment, but that clearly she knew where the real future was.
Well, and to me, it's also very interesting insight into how MAGA world incorporates young people. And I remember when I went to CPAC, I think back in 2018, and one of the things that struck me is that yes, there were all of these, sort of Republican Party stars, and Seb Gorka was there, and Steve Bannon was there, but you could talk to all of them. I mean, it was both this big event, but it's also kind of small. You can walk up to Ted Cruz and say, hello, here's my resume. Wow. I want a job.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think MAGA has really perfected is having this kind of openness to someone who knows how to hustle and knows how to work hard and knows how to promote themselves. And I think a lot of these young people who have sort of become shooting stars, Stephen Miller is another one, are people who don't take no for an answer, and they know how to put themselves front and center. But Neil, let's sort of roll it back a little bit, because being press secretary has not always been a star-studded position. And in fact, the role of press secretary, interestingly, doesn't develop until the age of modern media, which is radio in the late 1920s. The first press secretary, poor guy, worked for Herbert Hoover. But what's the job of press secretary, and how does it evolve over time?
Well, I think, the job is to communicate the message of the White House to the Washington Press Corps, and to answer questions that the press corps has about presidential decisions, policies that are coming out, the direction of an administration. In a lot of ways, it shouldn't be all that flashy of a role. It's certainly not necessarily one that the average American knows. But I think over the course, especially the last couple of decades, it has become one of the positions that I think Americans are most familiar with because of the visibility of it. And I think that tracks with, large transformations in our media universe, particularly rise of cable news and sort of 24/7 media. So with that development, this role takes on a lot more visibility, prestige, influence, and power. And I think especially within a Trump administration or a Trump presidency that is so obsessed with the media and news and its own coverage, then all the more so. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we can also think about is why so many women have been in this role in recent years. I mean, that wasn't the case historically. It's been much more the case in the last couple of decades. And then I think almost everyone except for maybe one person in the Trump two presidencies has been a woman.
That is right? Absolutely correct. Sean Spicer, poor Sean Spicer, hiding in a bush. Sean Spicer,
who's then portrayed by a woman on SNL.
Exactly. No, the first woman to do the job is Dee Dee Myers, who was Bill Clinton's campaign spokesman. A thankless job if there ever was one. But I have two theories here. One is that actually Clinton sticks with Dee Dee Myers because of all of the sex scandals that are bubbling up and that are going to continue to bubble up during his presidency. And having a woman be front and center to handle those questions strikes me as a strategy. I mean, Dee Dee was very good at her job. But the other theory I have about why press secretaries became these kind of superstars is that Dee Dee Myers does that job for Bill Clinton for 2 years, I think. I think she leaves at the end of 1994. She then becomes one of the executive producers of The West Wing.
Right.
And there is a character on The West Wing, played by Allison Janney, called C.J. Craig, who plays the first woman to be press secretary. And C.J. Craig is sort of one of the anchors. She's one of the moral anchors of the show. And so I sort of had this theory that it's really The West Wing that caused Americans to pay attention to the press secretary as a player in the White House.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm not I mean, maybe I shouldn't confess this, but I'm not a West Wing watcher. I never saw the show. I do have to tell my Dee Dee Myers story, which is that I sat next to her in a restaurant in Las Vegas, of all places, and just stared at her the entire time. And that was a big celeb sighting for me, which just, speaks to the political nerdery of myself. And like that, I think that makes so much sense for Dee Dee Myers to have been the person that had to navigate those news stories through the Clinton administration. And then that also tracks with why Trump might want to have women always in this role. Although I think it's also, like I said earlier, informed by his sense of hot babes on Fox News. And that's who you get the news from.
I think that's right. I also think that Trump, and it's a weird thing to say about such a raging sexist who sexually assaults people, I think he likes women, and I think he thinks women get him in a way that men don't get him. So there was this odd tension between Trump, the raging sexist, and Trump, the guy who's always depending on some woman to sort of keep him pasted together. And there have been a series of such women who have cared for him. One of them, I'm trying to remember her name, but there was a big profile of her in the New York Times, who is basically like his body woman. She's the one that, is always there at the end of a press conference to say, "Oh, you did such a great job, Mr. President." I mean, her job is just to make him feel okay about the world.
Yeah.
But I agree with you about the Fox News thing. Another CPAC story, I was in the media section because I had press credentials. And I looked behind me at one point, and it was all of the, MSNBC people. They hardly ever showed up. But all of the alternative media people were there all the time. And there was a table of women, all with long blonde hair and boob jobs and nose jobs. And literally they all looked alike. And they were all bloggers and podcasters and so on, who were there to be noticed. And there was a certain look that you had to have. And obviously, Karoline Leavitt has the look.
Yep.
Yeah. So, all right.
I'm not going to talk about women's bodies, but yes.
Oh, but I can, right? Because I'm a
brought
lesbian. Yeah, right. Okay. So, as you said, in the first administration, Trump had 4 press secretaries, Sean Spicer, who told the first of thousands of outrageous lies when he went out there and insisted that Trump's crowds were bigger than Obama's.
Right.
My favorite press secretary was Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and I am going somewhere with this. I thought Sarah Huckabee Sanders was just so fucking cool on a certain level. I mean, she always was wearing the pearls, and she was big girl. She's lost a lot of weight, actually.
Yes.
Still talking about women's bodies. Maybe I should really stop doing this, but she would also just like take reporters down whenever she thought they had asked a question that shouldn't have been asked, or they said something that she didn't like. And I just thought she was really kind of bossy.
I was not expecting you to. I was not expecting this to be like a fanning for Sanders. But I, picking up on what you said, I think you're right. I mean, there's an interesting sort of comparison we can make between Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Leavitt, because I think like Leavitt feels like a really well-trained robot who's like thoroughly ingested the messaging, who is like sort of only come of age within a Trump, moment of history, and like has has like taken it all in and can give it back out. Sanders, I think, is smart and had like her own ideas and knew sort of how to articulate Trump and Trumpism through a larger, worldview that she had that, obviously overlapped greatly with Trump's, but that like, there were some smarts to her. And she also seemed to really, I mean, both of them relish in taking media down, right? And and sort of excoriating
Yep.
press, people for asking questions. But Karoline Leavitt does it with a little bit of a like Tracy Flick sort of energy,
Yes.
whereas Sarah Huckabee Sanders was like this sort of just cruel righteousness,
Yeah.
that like, how dare you? And you're going to be punished for this.
Right. Well, it's interesting because actually Caroline Leavitt does punish people and
Yeah,
participates in punishing people. And I think this is in a very short period of time. We have gone from the punishment is I'm just going to humiliate you, guy from the
right.
New York Times, to I'm going to take your chair. And you don't get to sit at the front of the room anymore. You get to sit in the back of the room with all the bloggers. And I think the Tracy Flick energy is absolutely there. It's also kind of the way a really mean teacher would respond to people she didn't like. You go sit in the back of the room with, all of the guys who are, carving their names into the desks and so on and so forth. See what happens to you there. But I think the comparison to Sanders is an important one because, of course, even though Sarah Huckabee Sanders is the daughter of a former governor of Arkansas, a very popular governor of Arkansas, and that gave her a leg up to that job, doubtless. Nevertheless, I don't think I've ever seen the press secretary's job become a step up to elected office before Sanders. And so Leavitt, as someone who ran a good race but failed to win the congressional seat, you have to think that she's got her eye on elected office again, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think she will be very well positioned coming out of it this time than she was sort of running in obscurity in New Hampshire the first time around. I mean, she could go straight to a Senate position, right? In New Hampshire, you would think, or governor, something like that. I think that this is a huge launching pad for her. I mean, again, just your point about her putting people to the back of a room and sort of whipping them on the hand with her ruler. The question that we opened with was like, what's the role of the press secretary and what was the point of this job? And I think, we answered it in sort of how it's been historically, but then there's like, what's its role? What's its functioning right now?
Right.
It is not about dialogue with the press. It's not about taking questions and responding in a way. I mean, like they're going through the motions of that, but like, what is the actual point of all this, especially when so much of the time that allotted is used to berate the press for their questions and to like literally move them around the room, and also to showcase the alternative people who are being brought into this, who are like from the farthest fringes of MAGA world. This is a show for the base. This is a show for the base. This is all sort of about the performance art of MAGA politics for the rabid base, and she is the ringmaster of it all and is loving the role.
Right. And she's done something that Sarah Huckabee Sanders never did. And I mean, in a way, it's much more a comment on how swiftly the media environment has moved since the first Trump administration. So Leavitt established a seat for a new media person. So like theoretically, Neil, you and I could like apply for that seat and go to a press briefing. Although I don't think they would take us. But she also does briefings for influencers now.
Right.
And the briefings for influencers, I actually watched a couple of them, and they're fascinating because the influencers sit there and spin out conspiracy theories. And that made me think part of Karoline Leavitt's job is to make the argument for Trumpism on a daily basis that Donald Trump is no longer capable of making on his own. I mean, if you look at how he responds when he's asked questions, he's gone well beyond the lying and the forgetting and so on. He's very repetitive.
Yes.
He rarely says anything of substance anymore. And Karoline Leavitt takes all of that and distills it into an actual message that is broadcast at least once a day on YouTube.
Yeah, and something that really has struck me in the last, I would say, 2 weeks is how almost every single clip I've seen of Trump being asked a question,
Right.
he has responded, I don't know about that. I mean, literally every single every single topic, every single issue that's happening in the world today, he gets asked about, and why he's putting himself before the cameras constantly. I mean, we know
Right.
why he is. He's addicted to this, but yet he has shifted into this place, and it was always there to some extent. But like I said, I think that he has led every single response of the last couple of weeks with, "I don't know what you're talking about," or "I haven't heard that yet."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
just suggest, we know that he's not abreast of the news
Right.
or reading press, his daily bulletin or anything like that, but that he can't even sort of, as you're saying, operate in the way that he normally has as
Right.
a great communicator and a great spinner. Like, he's just sort of starting from this place of like, I don't even know what you're talking about.
Right.
And then sort of stumbling from there. But yeah, and I think it's so smart. It's really scary, but so smart of this White House to be cultivating those relationships with influencers, because clearly that's where, like, news consumption is going for younger generations and all that. But I don't think there's any analog on the left that's like building up a structure and a system that sort of competes with the
No.
ways that the Trump White House is just completely transforming,
Yep.
public media or media.
No, they're very far ahead of us in that. And I think it was Peter Beinart who said in the Adam Wren profile that we read for this, which I'll link to, listeners. I think it was Peter Beinart who said, you go to these press conferences and there's no information.
Right, exactly.
You'll never get any information. And one of the things that made me think about is a podcast that I have started listening to that I avoided for a long time, Pod Save America. And I was listening to it again today when I was in the garden. And I thought, one of the reasons I think I didn't listen to this for so long is you don't get any information. It's a bunch of guys sitting around sharing their opinions about this and that, but you don't get any history. You don't get any inside information. You don't get any expert analysis. And that seems to be what Karoline Leavitt is doing, is she is expressing an attitude about
Right.
politics, but there's no information there.
Yep.
I just want to close this segment by saying, that I think one of the ways that anyone in the administration knows that they're making an impact is if somebody is spoofing them. We talked about Melissa McCarthy doing Sean Spicer on Saturday Night Live as this kind of like enraged, angry, insult-driven liar who berated the press incessantly. My favorite Karoline imitator is Lysandra Vasquez, an Atlanta comic who posts her imitations on TikTok. And in some of them, she has accurately predicted what Karoline Leavitt will say later that day about a topic. And she will actually post her imitation and then Karoline Leavitt side by side. But the other thing she does, and this is the last place to land with this, is she wears extremely elaborate crosses. So when she was talking about the China tariff, Lysandra was wearing a cross made up of fortune cookies. She wears crosses made of beer cans. She makes crosses made of Amazon boxes. And this leads me to the commentary about Karoline Leavitt very prominently wearing a cross as press secretary. What are we to make of this, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that she's wearing a cross, it's that her crosses are so enormous and so showy, right? Like, it's not newsworthy for someone to be wearing a cross around their neck at all. But like the oversized crosses that are constantly around her neck are clearly a sign of just, again, part of the public performance.
Right. And apparently there are a lot of crosses in the White House.
She acted in sort of in a way that was in keeping with that cross, but I don't think that's what we're getting from this administration.
We're all going to have to turn to the Vatican for morality in the next few years. So, Neil, what do we want to go viral this week? You start.
Okay, I want to talk about this Barry Diller piece that just came out in New York Magazine. Have you read it?
Not
Do you know
yet.
about this? Okay,
No.
you've not heard about this?
No, I'm behind.
So Barry Diller, the media mogul,
Yep.
has apparently a memoir coming out soon from Simon and Schuster, and there's a portion that's excerpted in the New York Magazine, and the title they gave it was "Barry and Diane: The Truth About Us After All These Years." This is it's an incredible piece of writing. Okay, so for people who may not be as familiar with all this, Barry Diller is a gay man who has been married to Diane von Furstenberg, the huge, fashion designer, for a really long time. And I think, for me, as living in New York City for many, many years, like there were so many times when it was like a friend of a friend of a friend knew someone who had slept with Barry Diller. And it was just sort of this like, if you were young and gay in New York, you were like 2 degrees of separation around some boy who had like spent time with Barry Diller. And that was just like known. And it was sort of like, oh, he and Diane von Furstenberg, like she's the beard. It's like,
Right.
why are they doing this? Also was, I think, a big open question, because it's like, they live in New York City. He works in media. She works in
Right.
fashion. Like, what is this about? I think a lot of people speculated it was some sort of financial arrangement. But again, both of them were wildly rich. So why would they need that? Well, this excerpt is stunning. And it talks about how he has had sex with men like all his life. But that like from a young age, he just felt like he was never really going to be able to be an out homosexual man. And I imagine the book gets into more, depth about what the reasoning there is, but sort of caught in a moment in time in which he just sort of made this decision, like, and he said, he sort of, the pledge he made or the promise he made to himself was like, he was never going to be fake. He was never going to like have a date with a woman to like try and like dissuade rumors about him. But he just was never not going to live a sort of public life at all about sexuality. But that he met Diane von Furstenberg through friends in the 1970s, and that as he writes at length in this excerpt, and I suppose even more in the book, they just had this insane connection that was also very sexual, very physical, very intellectual, very emotional, like all the things you would want out of a relationship. And almost that she is the singular figure, the only person he's been in a relationship with. And so it's really a incredible piece to read, especially just so interesting to hear him talk about like the start of their relationship and sort of just the incredible attractive pull they had, and how it caught him so unaware, but that it amounted to the great love and the great relationship of his life. He doesn't in the excerpt talk about sort of what their arrangement was or what their sort of conversations were around, other aspects of his life. Again, I imagine the book probably gets into that, but it's quite a read. Definitely recommend it. We'll include it in the show notes.
I can't wait.
I also love that title, "The Truth About Us After All These Years." I mean, it's just, it's there on the nose, like, right? That's the question I have to answer.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. I can think off the top of my head of 2 gay men who have had big love affairs with women. And if I really dug around, I could probably think of more in my experience. And I think sometimes we don't give people enough credit for being able to reach across what we think are the common strictures of identity. And I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of how he closes the excerpt.
Yeah.
There's a short paragraph. And again, like I imagine the book maybe explores this in more depth, but at the end of the sort of near the end of the excerpt that they publish, he's sort of like, he's like, in Europe, people know how to do this differently, and so there's like a nod to that, but and he's not wrong. But yeah, I mean, our sort of categorizations have been like they've had hard boundaries, I think, in American life in the 20th century. So anyway.
Very hard boundaries, and people often assume it's just about a really deep friendship, when in fact such relationships are sometimes very erotic. So, all right. Well, that's great, Neil. Thank you. I can't wait to pull my New York Magazine out of my mailbox. The thing I would like to go viral this week. So I think some readers of Political Junkie know I've begun taking improv classes. I referenced this a few weeks ago, which I adore my improv classes. They're absolutely wonderful. And the teacher recommended a 2021 documentary called Inventing Improv, which was produced by Chicago Public Television. Thank you very much. And it's a history of Second City, the big comedy establishment in Chicago that ultimately produces Saturday Night Live and, tons of famous comics. But Second City came out of a new kind of theater that was invented at, wait for it, Jane Addams' Hull House in the 1930s by a social worker whose name was Viola Spolin. And Spolin she taught theater, but the first thing she realized at Hull House was that there were all of these children who spoke all these different languages and they really couldn't speak to each other. So she used theater as a way to connect them and teach empathy for others and create cross-cultural contact in the absence of a common language. And so it was based on group work, play, and spontaneous games, many of which survive in improv today. I mean, as I was watching this film, I recognized certain kinds of things that I'm doing in my improv class. So the very first improv troupe is at Hull House, and it becomes kind of famous in Chicago. Then Spolin gets married. The guy she's married to goes off to fight World War II. But the work she did at Hull House was funded by the New Deal's WPA. And then she goes to Los Angeles and she takes this new theater technique and starts working with actors and actresses after World War II in Los Angeles. So we begin to see people like Alan Alda is taking these classes and, a range of people. And then her son Paul goes back to Chicago to be at the University of Chicago. He enrolls there. And he's still interested in theater, but there's no theater at the University of Chicago. So he and a friend start this theater troupe in a Chinese restaurant, an abandoned Chinese restaurant. And as it turns out, the friend is some kind of fabulous heir, has tons of money. And the friend says, well, I will finance your little theater troupe if you help me do something based on the Commedia dell'arte, which was this sort of radical form of theater in the early modern period where the troupe would go from town to town and they would talk to people and then they would spontaneously put on a play. And so these two guys are kind of working on it and they do it. And eventually that becomes Second City. And then Second City becomes Saturday Night Live. So it's a great video. It's an hour documentary, and it shows the development of something that we take for granted now as something that's not just entertaining, but very, very political, and how it begins at Jane Addams' Hull House.
That's amazing. I'm going to have to watch that. What a fascinating history.
It's really, really fun, Neil. I couldn't recommend it more. And listeners, as I say, only an hour. And there'll be a link to it in the show notes. And with that, Neil, our own personal weekly improv is done.
All right.
I'll see you next week.
Peace be with you.